Good afternoon. Thank you all for your attendance. We know that it's a difficult time, and welcome to a new edition of the lecture series we call in the Institute Self-Government Views in a Complex World. As many of you know, we have dealt in these lectures about several and complex cases like Chile, the Constitutional Convention, Afghanistan, and recently we talked about the post-Brexit United Kingdom. On this occasion, as you know, we want to analyze the situation of another complex country, big country, by the hand of the professor Félix Mathieu, under, I think, suggestive title, at least I think so, divided we stand, Identity, Federalism, and Regionalism. And Félix Mathieu is assistant professor of the Department of Political Science at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, in Canada. Currently, if I'm not wrong, he's visiting a scholar in the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, and he was graduated with a scholarship of the Institute to research about second chambers in the federalism systems. Needless to say, he's an expert of the theory and practice of the federalism, nationalism, and management of the complexity in the current world. Indeed, this title is very linked with the situation in Canada after the few federal elections. I think less convulsive elections than the recent elections in Catalonia and in Spain the last weekend. And these elections, we think, revealed once more that Canada is a divided country. And with this lecture, we want to know how divided, how we can explain in political terms that division. Precisely, our guest today is the author, together with another professor, Evelyn Vrie, I think from the Bell province, like you, of a book, a study that constitutes a serious attempt to answer these questions. The title is Un pays divisé, Identité, Fédéralisme et Régionalisme. Donc, dans ce livre, le professeur Mathieu met en relief, en évidence, les préférences institutionnelles au niveau provincial et régional, les façons dont les différentes catégories de la population comprennent les avantages ou les inconvénients du système fédéral et ainsi les rapports qu'elle entretient avec certaines politiques publiques telles que les programmes de lutte contre les inégalités ou contre les changements climatiques and so on. So, Professor Mathieu, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Merci. Thank you so much, Johan, for this kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you to the Institute for making all this possible, for me to receive this scholarship to come here to work on some issues related to federalism, power sharing as well in multinational democracies. It's especially pleasant for me to be here as I can see again some old friends, but also meeting for the first time some people like Professor Javier Arbos here that we've met virtually 10 years ago, but haven't met so far. So I'm pretty happy to be here for this to be possible. Many thanks to Mireia as well for all the coordination with the program and all the staff that worked on this. I'm really appreciative of all this. So I'm going to be talking for about 35 minutes, I guess. That would be fine. So today, my point is not to say that Canada is divided to an extent that is out of proportion looking at a comparative perspective, looking at general elections here at the municipal level over the past few days. I mean, Spain is a divided country. Looking at the elections in Turkey over the past few days, clearly Turkey is a divided country. I think divisions are ever present in many democracies, in many liberal democracies. And my point here is not so much to say that we should try to solve them if that means to suppress divisions, because I believe divisions up to a certain extent are a positive and natural consequence of a healthy democracy, but rather to look at how can we think of these divisions, how much they actually matter from a political and institutional perspective, but also how can we think of intuitive ways to manage them in a constructive manner rather than try to solve them with only strict power relations of the most powerful partner imposing its views on the minorities. Marc St. John with Ferran Riquero just published an edited volume on defensive federalism. So I think it goes in that direction of looking at how federalism could be a way to manage divisions in complex societies, in complex democracies, while preventing the tyranny of the majority that plays out in various ways. But before I talk about that, so how this whole project, so this led to a book, as Joanne said, but this whole project actually started in 2017, December 2017, where we had just started a new research center under the leadership of Professor Alain G. Gagnon at the Université du Québec à Montréal, the Centre d'analyse politique, Constitution et fédéralisme, so CAP-CF. And with that research center, one of the very first activity that we contributed to was a partnership with the Envirnix Research for Survey, that partner with 5 other different research institutes throughout Canada. And we wanted to organize, on the one hand, a conference that would be titled Confederation of Tomorrow 2.0, which echoed 50 years later a famous conference that had been organized by then Premier of Ontario in 1967 to discuss about these intense divisions that were occurring in Canada and how can we manage these, because this was a time of big turmoil between the French-speaking community, English-speaking community. Multiculturalism was not yet a policy in Canada, but more and more people were talking about this and how can we deal with all these issues. And so 50 years later, we were contemplating that divisions were still something that was going on, and many problems that were discussed 50 years before that were still unresolved. So how can we try to make sense of all this? And we've organized this conference, launching the first wave of a series of large-scale surveys that we've implemented every year since 2017. And so throughout a series of events, myself as a representative of the CAP-CF here, but with colleagues from all around Canada, we traveled around the country and organized a series of events with policymakers, with elected representatives, with people from civil society, and we tried to make sense of these ongoing data that we were producing. And as we were making these conferences, I realized quite rapidly that my perspective, coming mostly from a Quebec perspective on these issues, was contrasting with some other perspective. And so we weren't seeing the same things, looking at the same data. And discussing all this with my colleague Evelyne Berry, who's an expert in quantitative methods. I'm not. I mean, I can do descriptive statistical analysis, but nothing more than that. And so I decided to ask her if she would like to partner with me to try to exploit these data and make sense of this plus value. And this led to this book, Un pays divisé, which is now in the process of being translated, and we have a publishing agreement with the University of Toronto Press. So hopefully in 2024, this will exist in English as well. And with this book, basically the puzzle, what we were interested into, is that clearly everyone looking at these data agreed that Canadians were divided, and we're looking at Canada's and seeing clearly some structural problems with how institutions work. But there were no consensus both on the interpretative aspect of it, but also looking at Canadians' perspective on what are the causes of these problems, what are the dynamics, the socio-political dynamics that are feeding them, and how should we be dealing with these divisions. And so as we were trying to make sense of all these data, which accumulated into a series of 5 years of various waves of data from 2017, and now we have until 2023, we tried to look at these divisions from three different analytical angles or lenses. So from the individual perspective, how Canadians express differentiated institutional preferences, but also how they self-identify, looking at the Lins-Moreno identity scale, for instance. And then we tried to control for these variables to look into how Canadians see problems that relate to how the federal system work, how institutions work, how should they be working, more centralization, more decentralization, etc. And then we open up once more the analytical focus to look into regions, which is an analytical category of great value, but as a scholar coming from Quebec, I had never used the variable of regions before, because in Canada, when we talk about regions, Quebec, just like Ontario for that matter, is considered a region in itself. And so as someone that did my studies in Quebec, why should I bother with the unit of regions if it equates with the same thing than provinces? And as I was hired in English Canada to start my career at the University of Winnipeg, I realized quite rapidly that regions mean something for people in other parts of the country. In Western Canada, in Manitoba, where I live professionally, the regions matter a lot. That's actually a part of their core understanding of who they are as a Canadian, what they share as common interests, and what political issues they see the same way. And so we tried to introduce once more the variable of regions and regionalism into our analysis. So this book here was actually written mostly in the winter of 2021. So this was the long stretch, the fast stretch of writing. We did the analysis mostly in 2020, but the writing was in 2021. And I remember at the very last moment feeling something similar that was going on this week when a snap election was called in the summer of 2021. And we had this book in the coming, and our publisher really wanted the book to be released within the electoral campaign. So we had to work all this through very fast at the end. And it also, so the book came out during the federal elections, trying to understand divisions that were feeding them. And so it also contributed to the book being discussed by some leaders of the political parties at that point and trying to connect their own political platforms with these views here. But I was thinking at what people are thinking right now politically in Spain, looking at these next 50 days or so and how division's going to play out and what's going on politically speaking. And it brought me back into this perspective of, yes, doing a piece of academic work, but knowing it's going to have some impact into the political arena. In the English-speaking version of the book, we've also included new data from after the pandemic to try to control for this event, how it impacted divisions in Canada. Unfortunately, I don't have the graphs prepared for today, but I'll tell you a bit about this. But spoiler alert, didn't change a lot. So I thought it would actually impact significantly some of the divisions in Canada. It only consolidated tendencies and trends that we were observing. And so the book is about descriptive statistical analysis, and we also end up doing a series of policy recommendations, which I will discuss with you at the end of my talk. So the first variable that I'll be talking about is identity, how people in Canada are divided when they think about their identity, what matters mostly to them as they are trying to self-represent who they are. And the best way to do this, or the most common way to do this, is to look into the Linz-Moreno scale. Thinking of Luis Moreno, who disappeared, who died a few months ago, an incredible scholar who made an incredible contribution. In the book, we used his scale, asking people to identify on this scale of two identity poles, whether they believe they have a stronger Canadian or pan-Canadian identity pole, or more provincial or territorial identity pole, or something in the middle, an equi-primordial representation of that. And looking at Canada as a whole, we see that the most popular option, which is about a third of the population, is saying I basically share both identity poles equally when I self-represent myself. But of course, this is the general portrait, but when we look into trends in different provinces and territories, we see interesting variations. So when we look at how people, the percentage of people, of Canadians, who say they have a predominantly pan-Canadian composite identity, meaning that Canada has a more important impact when they self-represent themselves than their province or regions, we see that one provincial partner, Ontario, and the three northern territories express a clearly predominant pan-Canadian identity pole when they self-represent. And we try to explain this trends in two ways. First of all, when we look at Ontario, well, Ontario is also home to Canada's capital in Ottawa. And so for many Ontarians, I guess in a similar way than for many people in Madrid here in Spain, they kind of conflate the Canadian identity with the Ontarian identity, and the Ontarian identity with the Canadian one. So they kind of see both as forming only one general identity, and that's pretty common when we look at where capital are also in one specific regions in a multinational democracy. For the three northern territories, because Canada is made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories, the 3 territories are not parties to the federal system in the same way. They're actually subordinated to the federal parliament, and so all the authority, the power they have, is actually voted by the federal parliament. The federal parliament could take it back whenever they want. Of course, it would come with a political price, but still, this is a way to understand that people in northern territories kind of see their identity as being more directly connected with the central state, although they are very far from it geographically speaking. Now, when we look at the opposite question, when we ask people, when we look at those who say they have a predominantly provincial composite identity, 2 provincial partners are distinct from the rest of the group, Quebec and Newfoundland, or Terre-Neuve-et-Labrador, written in French here. We explain these 2 situations with contextual reasons. Both Quebec and Newfoundland have a distinct cultural, political identity that has been designed and redesigned over decades. Quebec, I think it's pretty obvious, and you might all know about it already. But regarding Newfoundland, not many people outside of Canada, and even within Canada, know about it. But Newfoundland only joined the Canadian federal system in 1949 after 2 failed referendums. And when they got into the Canadian federal system, it was by a very thin majority. And every now and then, when people in Newfoundland disagree with policies in Ottawa, they tend to bring down the flags, the Canadian flags. They have their own national anthem, songs, and so they have a specific distinct identity, and it's also an island. So islandness produces kind of a differentiated understanding of who they are as a Canadian. Now, looking at equiprimordial identity, we see that many other provinces actually have a plurality of their members who say, I can't choose. Basically, I have an identity that is made up equally by both my provincial and pan-Canadian identity poles. Now, when we look at something, I've only focused on a few of the questions we've asked in the book. Of course, we have over 200 figures in the book, but I identified some of these that I believe would be most interested for you here in Barcelona, looking at the Catalan-Spanish debate. So, of course, the issue of how much French matters in people's identity in Quebec, but also how people believe that French is either endangered as a language, as a minority language in Canada, depending on if you're in Quebec, therefore living in the province, the only province where a majority of the population speaks French, compared to the rest of the country. And we see that this linguistic aspect, which is a core identity marker for Quebecers, is seen as something that is being endangered, that is fragile. For most Quebecers, actually, more than 50% of the Quebec population, but only by a very minority of people in the rest of Canada. And so this is also a way to explain why it's so difficult, it has been so difficult in Canada over the past few years, as parliamentarians in Ottawa try to renew and adapt the policy on Canadian bilingualism to recognize that we need to invest more energy and money, literally, to protect French in Canada than to protect English. Because right now, under Canadian bilingualism, both languages should be treated equally. And so the new revision that has been proposed by the Liberal Party of Canada, which has led to some members of the Liberal Party of Canada, the governing party right now, to resign over this, well, they say we should introduce some form of an asymmetrical treatment between French and English, as French is more fragile than English. But for many Canadians, they don't see this reality at all, and they also only see language as a communicative tool, not as an identity marker, whereas for most Quebecers, there is this identity issue that is core to the use of their language. Another thing that I wanted to share with you is looking at the percentage of Canadians who respond either favorably or disagree with the statement that they believe Canadians share essentially the same values. And so these are the data from 2020. We connected these data with the questions we were asking very similarly in the 1990s, where we had in Quebec the 1995 referendum. And we've seen that over the last 25 years, not only in Quebec, but in most Canadian provinces, people are less and less enthusiastic with the idea that they actually share the same value with Canadians from coast to coast. So this should be of concern for policymakers in Ottawa that try to build some cohesion and solidarity in Canada, albeit these differentiated understanding of what they share as Canadians. And we see that, for instance, in Quebec, it's the province where the fewer believe that they actually share the same value with people from the rest of the country. Now, I wanted to bring your attention to the second unit of analysis, that of federalism here. So as we aggregate data from provinces to province and look into how people express differentiated institutional preferences, how should we be dealing with Canadian institutions that relate to federalism? And the first aspect that I wanted to discuss with you, the first question that we actually asked, which is not data that we collected from our own original data, but from the Canada Electoral Study, as we completed our access to information. We asked Canadians, basically, are you satisfied with Canadian democracy? Before talking about federalism, the democratic system as a whole. And, well, basically, 3/4 of the Canadian population is relatively satisfied with it, which I think I thought it would have been lower than that. But when we look at specific populations, for instance, in the Western Prairies, in Alberta and Saskatchewan mostly, the two that you can see in the middle that are a little bit more dark in the red, you see that people are a lot more unsatisfied with Canadian democracy. But when we refine the question and ask whether they are satisfied with the federal government since 2015, so when the Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau took power over the Conservatives that were led by Stephen Harper, we see that people in Alberta and Saskatchewan are basically split evenly by saying we are very unsatisfied. Not only unsatisfied, but very unsatisfied, and that half of the Canadian population falls into this broader category of being unsatisfied with how the federal government actually worked, operated over the past few years since we had a Liberal government in power. So Liberal government in Canada is also quite fragile. We could discuss this from more political behavior perspective, but it was only able to be elected 3 times, last 2 times with minority government. We don't do coalitions in Canada because the Conservatives, the alternative, are internally divided. And a new Vox-style party also emerged in Canada, the Parti Populaire, so it's kind of contradiction because the Vox and the PP here, but it's because the Conservatives are internally divided that explains why Liberals are able to form governments once in a few times in a row. But then when we look into what's going on, why people are actually unsatisfied or dissatisfied with the federal government, we see that it's not the same trends that is going on from coast to coast. And that also connects with who's voting for the Liberal Party and for the Conservatives, or even in Quebec for the Bloc Québécois, so the independentist party that operates at the federal level. We see that there is a clear regional division here. So just talking a bit about regions before I go there in a few minutes later. And we see that basically west of Ontario, including Quebec and New Brunswick up to a certain extent, people are a lot more dissatisfied with the federal government than people are in the Maritimes and in the Northern Territories. We also see here, when we control for age, that the younger generations are less satisfied than the older generations. And this is actually worse in Quebec, looking at younger Quebecers. They are the most unsatisfied category of the Canadian population. Now, when we try to explain this, we asked basically other questions, because that's a broad question, how you satisfied or not with the federal government. We asked whether people believe that their province or their territory is treated with the respect they believe their province or territory deserves. And here we see that for a category of the Canadian population, for some regions, for some provinces, people believe that their province is not being treated with the respect it deserves at all. Only 2 provinces, actually Ontario believes it's fine, and Yukon as well, in Northern Territory. But looking at most other provinces, they say, no, we're not treated with the respect we deserve. And when we try to understand and explain this, we believe that there are 2 different explanations that need to be combined to get a full picture. Some are dissatisfied here because of what they perceive to be a fiscal discrimination against them. This would play out for Alberta and Saskatchewan, mostly with their relationships with the equalization program, so the internal wealth redistribution program we have in place in Canada since 1957. How do you, what's the, here in Spain it's the compensation fund. Yeah, exactly. So similar, constitutionally speaking, it's very similar, but how it plays out is different. So some partners believe that they suffer from a fiscal discrimination, but that cannot explain why people in Newfoundland believe they are not treated with the respect they deserve, since they have been receiving money from that program since day one. And so we need to look into another kind of discrimination, one of more political nature. And so looking at the first one, we see that the equalization program is something that is very positively viewed by most Canadians. 83% of Canadians are in favor of it. And even in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where you see the most important pool of the population, looking at provincially speaking, that are disagreeing with that program, still a majority of the population is in favor of that. Although politically speaking, and there were provincial elections last week, this week actually in Alberta, which led to the re-election of Danielle Smith's United Conservative Party. They're still making a lot of political points talking about how unfair the equalization program is. So it clearly plays a role in people's social imaginary or collective representations, how they see the system working. But for other cases, we need to look at something else. So when we ask people whether they believe that their own province or territory enjoys their fair share of influence within the federal system, we see that only the two one that we already discussed, Ontario and Yukon, they believe that that's all fine, but everywhere else, people believe that their province does not have their fair share of influence within the federal system, within how policy decisions are made in Ottawa. And when we ask who's to blame, so if you do not receive your fair share of influence, who you believe actually receive it. For most Canadians, it's either Ontario or Quebec. And I'll come back to this when we talk about regions. But also we look at some other variables, other questions. For many people, a growing proportion of people in the Western Prairies, they tend to say that the federal government is virtually irrelevant for them. They don't think about the federal government on a day-to-day basis when they talk about politics, which is something that policymakers in Ottawa should be concerned with again. Now, of course, a key question that I had to ask here is whether people would prefer a higher centralized country or a greater decentralization for thinking of the division of powers between the central government and the provincial order of government, or should they prefer status quo, so maintaining what is at stake right now. And it's pretty interesting to see that although Canada is arguably one of the most decentralized federal system in the world, the plurality of Canadians are actually in favor of greater decentralization, 39-point-something% to be precise. And it's followed specifically by the status quo, which is also in favor of significant decentralization, and only about 22% is in favor of greater centralization. But of course, that's the general perspective, but when we zoom in into specific province or partners, we see that for some, mostly in Quebec, in the Western Prairies, Manitoba is quite an exception. They actually are divided in 3 equal parts. They all want, at the same degree, more centralization, more decentralization, and status quo. So that's why there's an asterisk here, but looking at Alberta and Saskatchewan, they really favor greater decentralization. Newfoundland as well wants more autonomy. And in some other provinces, in Ontario and in most Atlantic provinces, exception made for Newfoundland, they favor greater centralization. And there's also a generational division here. In Canada, we've been talking a lot over the past few years about the 40 years of Canadian patriation, when we patriated the Constitution from London, included to our constitutional order the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. And we see that there's a generational division over centralization and decentralization for people in Quebec and outside of Quebec. Basically, in Quebec, that has not signed the constitutional deal in 1982. The older generation, so basically 55 years old and more, that have vivid memory of that moment, tend to be a lot more in favor of decentralization. When you look at the same category of the population in English Canada, they see this moment as a much more positive event, and they actually favor greater centralization in the way that Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, the main constitutional architect of that time, favored as well. But that's not to say that we should go all the way to more decentralization or more centralization, because although this is a general trend, we've also asked people whether they would favor greater centralization or decentralization over specific policy issues. And so here again, for instance, over who should be in charge to deal with immigration and integration of newcomers, Quebec wants more power here. Ontario would prefer greater centralization. But when we look at other issues, environment, who should be dealing with marijuana, who should be dealing with energy, you see that partners are not always in favor of centralization or decentralization. It depends on the specific policy we're talking about. And so I'll get back to this later on, but that's only to say that if you want to manage institutional divisions, what Canadians would prefer, institutionally speaking here, a one-size-fits-all approach to either decentralization or centralization might not be the most efficient proposal, as you would create more division, but you should actually try to focus on a more fluid or flexible approach to have asymmetry in some issues and more symmetry in some others. And I'll get back to this later on. And third part of my talk, I'll talk about regionalism here for a moment. And looking at regionalism, few of the issues that I wanted to talk about, the one I've already discussed with you. So respondents that believe that one region is being favored over the others, and we see that Quebec and Ontario are the two partners that are identified as being more favored by policymakers in Ontario, in Ottawa. And the next graph here, I show where people are and who they actually identified as being favored by the institutional working. And it's fascinating to see that basically Ontarians, people in Ontario, they agree that it's because of themselves. They say, yes, we indeed receive favoritism in some way. People in Quebec are only a very minority that believes so. They would look into Ontario mostly and in the West. And people in the West, they are basically evenly split, saying it's because of either Ontario or Quebec that we are not treated fairly here, which I think it's interesting to see that people are actually pointing out to different partners to explain why they are dissatisfied with how it works. The point that I want to make talking about regions and regionalism is about looking at Western Canada as a regional bloc, although all four provinces have their own specificities. Manitoba is kind of in the middle, geographically speaking, of the country. Sometimes people feel they're not really in the West, they're in central Canada, but their interests rarely coincide with Ontario, and therefore they see politically themselves as more aligned with the West. People in British Columbia, the more western province in Canada, is separated from Alberta from a chain of mountains, and so they see themselves as having a different economy, a different lifestyle, etc. So it's not an homogeneous bloc. But when we ask people in the West whether they feel that West is being ignored, we see that a growing proportion of the population say so. Basically, 3/4 of the population, if you take the West as a bloc, would say that, yes, we are being ignored, which has been fueling the political movement called Wexit in Canada, echoing the Brexit movement, suggestion that the West should perhaps be an independent country. And we've actually asked these questions in the 1990s. In 2000, we've stopped. In 2010, it was asked one. And so in 2019, we've asked this question again to see the evolution of this trend. And we asked people whether they believe that Western Canada benefits so little from Canadian federalism that it should perhaps become an independent country. Now, this is a highly hypothetical question. There's no real debate about this. So I'm not telling you that we're going to have a referendum in Canada tomorrow over Wexit, but still you see that for a growing portion of the population in all Western provinces, people believe that it might be a positive idea to develop this Wexit political movements. I think, again, this should be concerning people in Ottawa, the policy makers here. And looking at a more pan-Canadian or regional perspective here, when we ask people whether they agree that Canadian federalism has more advantages than disadvantages, we see that there's a clear tendency of people in most provinces and most regions to see fewer advantages that they saw before in Canadian federalism. So the status quo, not reforming Canadian federalism, which we have failed to do for the last 40 years in Canada, institutionally speaking, it has led to growing dissatisfaction over the system, not people cheering more for that system. So I'll come back to this in a moment as well. And so I'll conclude here in a few moments discussing the what's next portion of the book. And also in the book, we have a whole chapter regarding indigenous populations, regarding all these issues. If you want to ask me some question about that, I'm happy to answer. But for the time being, I want to discuss four basically institutional paths that Canada could undertake to manage in some way or the other these divisions. Two of these options we reject as being bad ideas, politically speaking, and two others that we believe would be legitimate to move on. The first one is the status quo, which a political path that we reject, but of course it would be the politically speaking the easiest to implement because the absence of change of direction here, and because of electoral politics, just as it's the case here, people have short-term incentives, so it might be the most probable scenario to happen here. But if you are a partisan of Canadian unity, if you believe in the value of Canadian federalism, we believe that actually maintaining the status quo might be the worst idea of all, because looking at the evolution of these divisions, what we do in the book, connecting current data to the 1990s and early 2000s, we see that the status quo augmented these lure of divisions rather than solving them. So it's not a good idea, we believe, if one wants Canada to survive in its current form over the long haul. It actually might be the best strategy to follow if you want to fuel independentist movement both in Quebec but also in the West and regarding indigenous population. So the second option we discuss is that of the breakup of the country, which we believe is an option that is politically legitimate. We also believe and discuss in the book that most Canadians, and I would say many people in liberal democracies, sometimes are short-sighted, forgetting about history and how borders changed over the past few hundred years. And I don't see why people today maintain the idea that necessarily the next few hundred years would maintain the borders as we know it today. It might lead to greater integration with supranational organization, at the same time looking at how people want to control some specific aspect of their collective and political destiny. So we believe it's a possible, not a plausible, but a possible scenario if no serious reform is implemented, if we simply follow the status quo here. In Canada also, looking at our constitutional order, there is a legal path to achieve secession. If one looks at the reference for secession of Quebec, decision rendered by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1998 that identified basically a series of underlying constitutional principles: federalism, democracy, constitutionalism and the rule of law, and protection for minorities. And looking at these principles and the broader constitutional order, they said basically if there is a clear result over a clear question in a referendum, this would lead to obligation, duty to negotiate a potential secession of one province, which would also require constitutional revision of the Canadian Constitution. It opens up a legal path, but it doesn't open up a finality. It doesn't mean that it would work, but it's a possibility. And maybe in the discussion, if you're interested, we could talk about all this and the Clarity Act, as I know it's something that is being discussed here in Catalonia and Spain. And I think it's important to differentiate clearly the court's opinion from the Clarity Act, so the bill that the federal parliament enacted, which I don't believe clarified a lot of things, quite the contrary. And so looking at this potential option to break up the country, we also believe that there's no good reasons to refuse to imagine the emergence of future pluralist and democratic projects. It might just happen, although looking at support for independence in Quebec, it's still around 30% of the population, and in the West, it's more hypothetical than anything else, so that's not significant. But also looking at Indigenous peoples, although it's harder to imagine how Indigenous people could secede per se, but there's a growing proportion of both Indigenous scholars and Indigenous peoples in Canada that believe that they should have greater self-determination power. What would that mean concretely? It's still up to discussion, but I think we need to consider all this moving forward. The third option would be that of Unitarianism. Basically, it would be putting Pierre Elliott Trudeau's ideal for Canada 40 years ago, the actual Prime Minister of Canada's father, it would be putting Pierre Elliott Trudeau's idea on steroids, basically, to say we should maximize the idea that all Canadians should feel Canadians first and foremost. They should all share the same value, same understanding of what Canada is. We should basically suppress divisions by alleviating the institutions and the cultural references that are making these divisions possible. I would believe here that this would result in a highly unjust, unfair scenario for societal minorities of all sorts in Canada, both for Indigenous peoples, for Quebec, for official language minority groups, for regions as such, as I believe people invest a lot of energy identifying with these societal communities, and trying to suppress the value of these would be highly unjust looking at this from a liberal political perspective. It would also equate with a certain hard time for Canada's political DNA, which has been completely reimagined over the past 60 years as Canada being this highly pluralistic, open to diversity country. But at the same time, it would say, no, regions, societal communities, these should not matter, only ethnocultural attributes should matter. And I think it would equate with some form of political scenario that would provide a hard time for Canada's political DNA. And the last options we also discussed, which we favor as something that would be positive for Canada, is that of asymmetrical federalism in Canada, to reject Pierre Elliott Trudeau's vision of a province being a province being a province, and to understand that provinces are different in terms of socioeconomic aspect, that these differences should be valued and positively empowered, and that if some parts of the country would rather have a constitutional deal that leads into more asymmetry for that regions to have greater autonomy, for instance, that it should be possible, and the only way to achieve this would be to look at constitutional rounds on a regular basis for these not to result in zero-sum game. The idea would be to have regular fixed constitutional conferences to talk about which policy domains should we be giving more autonomy or centralize more. This would also be a way to include Indigenous peoples in constitutional discussions in Canada, so it would augment the process of reconciliation. However, this is not an option that is being favored by many politicians at the federal level in Canada, quite the contrary. And I'll just end up by saying that, yes, of course, every time we make this argument, there comes the famous hypothesis that was put in words by Jan Urk and Lawrence Anderson, the paradox of federalism or autonomy. If you give more autonomy to some regions, they will eventually fuel independentist movement up to a certain extent that the country will break up anyway. My answer to that is that it's a possibility, and my own finality when I look at social justice and power relations in liberal democracies is not to maintain unity at all costs, but rather to favor liberal, democratic, pluralistic projects. So I don't think this is necessarily a bad idea. I don't believe either that it's the only legitimate scenario moving on. federalism would be a good one. And the other answer to the paradox of federalism is that, have you found one case of a regional community that has asked and received greater institutional autonomy in a liberal democracy that actually succeeded? The answer is no. And so as long as this is the case, it's only an hypothesis that has never been confirmed, politically speaking, and therefore I believe there's no reason for people to be overtly concerned with the possibility of the breaking up of countries. Countries are pretty resilient in many ways. So thank you very much, and feel free to ask me any questions here.
Thank you very much, Professor Mathieu. It's 10 to 1. We have time, if you wish, to start a debate or a colloquium, or simply to address questions or suggestions to our guest, Professor Albors. Sorry, we have a held hand microphone.
My question is related to Alberta. The last election I've read, concerning the last election, I read in the newspapers, in the Edmonton Journal, that there was a clear divide concerning big cities such as Calgary and Edmonton and the rural areas, saying that the victory of Danielle Smith was mostly due to her success in the rural areas. My question is, in your research, in your data, have you found something that would tell you some difference of perception of Canada, of federalism, of autonomy, different in the rural areas from the urban areas?
Do you want to answer every question or accumulate all the questions?
I can take multiple ones.
Yeah. Say your name, please.
Diego Muro, University of St. Andrews. Thanks for your talk. I have 2 questions. Well, perhaps a comment and a question, sort of question. The first one is that you talk about divisions all the time. And I wonder if there's another way of talking about this, which is simply plurality of views. The moment you phrase it as divisions, you frame it as negative, you frame it as problematic, as something that may provide tension to the system, and it's simply plurality of views, as we have in Parliament, representing different views, and this being a good system of representation of territorial differences, right? So first, why differences? Why focus so much on differences or divisions, right? Why not plurality, simply? The second question has to do with, at one point you said, the status quo, right? The status quo is good in the short term, bad in the long term. And I wonder, how do you know that? I went to the doctor recently, and the doctor told me, you're in good health, but you're eating far too much cured meat, jamón, and vichy catalan, which is a salty mineral water we have here. How do I know I'm going to be better off leaving this stuff? And how do I know that the status quo is not preferable for my health? And the same goes with the status quo scenario that you have described. How do you know it's the country is going to be worse off with that scenario?
Thank you. Say, if you are so kind, say your name. It's for the recording. Thank you.
Mireia from the Institute. I have a similar question, Diego, but it's to what extent we can rely on public opinion data as being an indicator of a political cleavage. Because, for instance, 2 years ago in Germany, that doesn't seem to be a country that is questioned by its federalism, there was a huge debate on the powers of the Länder on education, specifically on the schedules, the timing of the schools. So it was a huge debate about whether the Länder should or should not have all the powers they have on education. But I don't think that this debate involves at all a questioning of federalism. So an image of a country and one point over differences, how can you say that it's a political debate that is translated later on the political agenda?
Thank you, Felix, for your clear talk and for giving us this information in English that will be very soon published in an English version book. I have two questions, or two reflections or comments. The first one is on the Canadian Constitution and the new brand of Canadian nationalism that Trudeau-Père promoted in the 80s as a response to the sovereignty referendum in Quebec. To what extent, or in your opinion, to what extent these divisions or plurality of views, as Diego prefers to call them, are the result of this form of nationalism promoted by the father of the current Prime Minister in the 80s, and these failed rounds of constitutional negotiations and so on? Was it a good idea, this multicultural, bilingual and individual rights Canada promoted in the 80s, or in the end it was a worse the solution than what you had before? And then a second question on the news we get from Quebec, and I don't know if I correctly understood what you are discussing now in Quebec, but I heard that the current government that was kind of afraid of touching the constitutional folder and so on, they finally came up with a sort of constitutional proposal or provincial constitutional idea. Can you tell us, if you know what this project is, can you tell us something about this idea of, would that be a sort of statut d'autonomia, statute of autonomy, like the Catalan state of autonomy, or would that be like a different project? Thank you, Felix.
Any more questions?
Maybe I answer to these. I think I have plenty to say already. Thanks a lot for your questions. I'll go in the same order that I received them. So thank you so much, Javier, for your question. So indeed, as Javier was saying, the province of Alberta went through provincial elections the last few days. And looking at the results, we can see that the United Conservative Party, which is kind of a right-wing libertarian party in Alberta, focused a lot on the exploitation of oil, of energy. They perform a lot, but I mean a lot better in rural areas than in Calgary and in Edmonton, the two urban centers of the province, where the NDP, so the left-leaning party, performs a lot better. And that's something that is actually common in many Canadian provinces, where you would see, for instance, a more right-wing or leaning party performing a lot better in rural areas than in urban centers. In Quebec, that's the case. For instance, the most left-leaning party, Québec solidaire, performs very well on the island of Montreal, but not at all external to that. And the Quebec government, the Coalition Avenir Québec, that works a lot more with identity issues, performs a lot better in rural areas. In the book, we do control for most of the variables that we've discussed today, for gender, for religion, language spoken at home, location, we're using postal code. And anytime we saw significant result, we address these in the book. And so absolutely, yes, this is a trend that we see, we have been seeing for the past 2-3 decades, growing divisions between urban environments and rural electorates that are disconnected up to a certain extent with the values they put forward and how they politicize issues. So that's something that we see in Canada, but I would say as well in many, many liberal democracies. I'm not so familiar with the context here in Catalonia, but I remember looking at public opinions in 2017, looking looking at the support for independence being a lot more positive in rural area outside of Barcelona than looking at specific places in Barcelona. So I think this is a trend that we see more broadly. So that would be my answer. Sir, your name again? Sorry, I didn't pick it up. Diego. Thank you, Diego, for your question. So the first question, which is fair enough, well, why division? Why are you talking about division? Is that not something inherently negative? I think not. So in the book, we do focus on the idea that divisions are inherent to liberal democracies. It's something that we've seen, that we need not necessarily to try to solve, but rather to manage in a constructive way. Why we actually focused on the idea of a divided country on division is because after the result of the 2019 federal elections, this is the editorial line that every major media, both in Canada and internationally, when they covered the result of the elections, said Canada is a divided country. It's more divided than ever before. And so the introduction actually builds on this narrative, saying that, okay, people say Canada is a divided country, but to what extent and what does that mean politically speaking? So actually the idea of talking about divisions rather than what people share, which would be the mirror aspect of it, is highly connected to a discursive issue that emerged in public debates that we use to make our book more appealing to the debate. But I agree with you, and maybe I should have made this point more clearly. I don't believe that divisions are necessarily a bad thing. Actually, the absence of divisions would be quite like a dangerous trend to observe. We should be concerned about that. Why should the status quo be necessarily a bad thing? Again, here, I decided to focus today with you on recent data, but we tried to connect the waves of data we collected over the past few years with questions that had been asked in the 1990s and that pollsters stopped using in the 2000s and basically never use it again because Quebec independentist movement was not a thing anymore. So pollsters said we need not to ask these questions anymore. So what we do is we connect today's trends with what was going on in the 1980s and 1990s in the book, and we see that since there is no major institutional reform changing how Canadian federalism operates and works since the past 45 years now, that actually divisions grew instead of downsizing. That's why we make the assumption that, and the argument that the absence of change, so maintaining the status quo, seem to be leading to greater division, not the other way around. But we can't know for sure. And every time political scientists are trying to make predictions, most of the time we fail. So that's why I use this as an open-ending question. We interpret things, we make policy recommendations, but of course we don't have a bowl of crystal to really understand this. But it's also a political argument that I believe we should not maintain the status quo because of various policy and ideological reasons in Canada. So it's both about the public opinions, but also a greater take on what's going on in Canadian politics in general.
But that's a key point, right? It's a political point. It doesn't come from the data. It's a political argument. It doesn't necessarily flow from what you have presented to us as empirical evidence.
Oh, absolutely.
We wouldn't have a natural experiment to say what would happen if we continue with the status quo or we implement reform. We cannot compare.
But we can't do a natural experiment of that we can't. So we can't know for sure, but looking at how we had this cycle of conferences with colleagues from New Brunswick, from Ontario, from Alberta, we were looking at the same data, but arriving at very differentiated understanding of what was going on and what was problematic. So I think that's, of course, open for debate, and we try to make our argument as clear as possible how we go there, but these are political argument, and so yeah, I agree with your the premise of your comment here. Not saying that these are neutral understanding of the data. Up to a certain extent, I would disagree that neutral observation of public opinions can actually exist. So I would answer it that way here. Mireia, thank you for your question. It brings me back, so to what extent can we actually rely on public opinions to have any significant or serious discussion here? When I teach about public opinions to my students, I have them read a famous text by a sociologist, a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote a piece that is entitled L'opinion publique n'existe pas. So public opinions doesn't exist. And he makes a series of points here that not only the way that you're going to frame your question, the timing you're going to ask it. There's so many variables that make it that public opinions are always constructed. It's not a real thing. It's a imagined conception of what people are thinking, looking at a sample size of the population, controlling for a variety of variables at a specific moment. And when we ask the same question before and just after a specific event, we see that people think differently. So why should we be using it? I think it's only one tool that we can use to look at how a democracy is evolving. It's not an ideal tool. We need to be pretty comfortable with these limitations. But as long as it's a tool, say let's use it and try to inform political debates about it. But also from a more analytical perspective, why should we be looking as political scientists to public opinions? It's because they actually matter a lot for politicians themselves. They use public opinion surveys all the time to make decisions, to justify actions or inactions, and therefore I would argue that it's also a responsibility of the scholar to be able to navigate these and discuss and even challenge political actors in their interpretation of social and political trends. So that would be my answer to you here, Mireia. Marc, about some ongoing debate in Quebec about the evolution of Canadian Constitution. So since 1982 in Canada, we've attempted 2 times to really revise the Canadian constitutional order. On the one hand, to satisfy Quebec's historical demands, but also to satisfy growing dissatisfactions in Indigenous peoples in Canada. So these occurred at the end of the 1980s and then 1992. They both failed because our constitutional order makes it very, very hard to actually enact any significant constitutional change. For anything that would have to do with the division of power, we need to have unanimous consent. And therefore, it's very difficult. But even if you want to change other most substantial aspect of the Constitution, you need to have at least 7 provinces that together would make up 50% of the population with you. And so the qualification to enact any change is so hard that we failed most of the time. And since the 1990s, people would say that the constitutional fruit is not ripe yet, and therefore we should not try to taste it or to use it. And therefore, people both in Quebec but also in Saskatchewan and Alberta, they decided to try to change the Canadian Constitution using the back door rather than to do it looking at the grand entrance of the Constitution, looking at how they could change internal aspect of their own provincial constitution using Section 45 of the Canadian Constitution that has to do with unilateral constitutional change. So the preamble of the Canadian Constitution says, this is something I say to my students all the time, we have a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. Because of that, the Canadian Constitution is not fully written nor fully unwritten. It's not fully bilingual, not fully unilingual. It relies both on constitutional text, but also on the jurisprudence produced by the Supreme Court of Canada. And so it's a complex thing to understand, and you can actually implement changes to the Constitution looking at what we call provincial constitutions, which is something that you can change even today, that is supposed to be included within the British North America Act of 1867. So it's a way to change the wording of the Constitution. Quebec did it with Bill 96, for instance, this year, and making it that in the Canadian Constitution, doing this amendment, right now we have a section that says that Quebec is a distinct nation, that its only official language is French. This has been added to the Canadian Constitution. This will be challenged in front of the courts, though. It's already in the process of being challenged. It will go up to the Supreme Court of Canada. We have a hierarchical court system in Canada. And so at some point, maybe in 5 years from now, if we are lucky and it goes fast, it can take more time than that. Javier could tell us a lot about this. We will see whether this holds or not, and to what extent. But it's also of a political matter, not only of a legal matter, because on the legal aspect, if ever it gets challenged and it passes on that the Supreme Court of Canada says, yes, this was constitutional, we fully integrate this within the Canadian constitutional architecture. Now, anytime the Supreme Court of Canada would have to make a judgment over something that has to do with division of powers, for instance, they would need to balance, for example, Section 27 of the Canadian Constitution, multiculturalism, with the fact that Quebec would be recognized as a distinct nation that has one official language and that its provincial government has the responsibility to protect this distinctiveness. If this holds up, then the Supreme Court of Canada would have to balance these two contradictory values. This is what the Quebec government wants to achieve, which is an autonomous party, so not a sovereigntist party. It's a nationalist, but not a sovereigntist or independentist party. If that fails, if in front of the tribunals it actually fails and the Supreme Court says, no, we invalid this, this constitutional revision using the unilateral clause, Section 45, this would, I presume, fuel a political movement of great discontent in Quebec, having one more time the highest tribunal in our Canadian court system, 9 federally appointed judges, without Quebec having anything to say to who is going to be judges, decide on what Quebec can or cannot do constitutionally speaking. This would probably fuel an independentist movement, but right now it's hard to see that it could be as intense as it was in the 1990s. But for some hardcore sovereigntists or independentists in Quebec, they are looking forward to this moment to capitalize, to use this as an argument that there's no other way but secession for Quebec to evolve, because the Canadian constitutional order would be sterile, would be a legal straitjacket rather than a legal empowering mechanism. So that would be my first answer to that. And the second answer, to what extent are the divisions we've been talking today connected to what happened in 1992 with the Canadian repatriation, the introduction of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom? It's hard to say, to pinpoint like that's specifically connected to this. So my answer would be highly interpretative of that. But something of interest is to look at what happened just before Canadian repatriation. There was a Canadian task force led by Jean-Luc Pépin and John Roberts. John Roberts, who was the former premier of Ontario, who organized in 1967 the Confederation of Tomorrow conference. I'm going back, see, it's quite coherent, going back to what I said at the beginning here. They chaired this commission, task force, which was called Canadian Unity. This was commissioned by Pierre-Elliott Trudeau himself. They produced a report basically saying we should go into the direction of greater institutional asymmetry, that we should conceive Canada as being composed of 5 regions, and that for the time being, if Quebec wants to have more power, let's give more power to Quebec, but if the other regions want to have more power at some point, we should be able to negotiate this in the future. So in a similar way that the special regions work in the Italian constitutional framework. This report was received, I think in October 1979, and basically a few hours later, it was put into the library on the bookshelf and never used again. And Pierre-Elliott Trudeau made it clear that he never wanted anyone to talk about this report because he highly disagreed with the recommendation. And so it's interesting to see there was looking at path dependency, there were clearly two institutional paths here, and because of power relations, because one was Prime Minister of Canada, he won the power relations, introduced a specific institutional path that led to the current constitutional order that displeases for various reasons to a variety of Canadians.
Any more questions? No? So if you agree, we can finish now. I want to thank again your lecture and your additional explanations, and thank you all, and see you in the next event of the Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you.